Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Christine Lee, and it gives me great pleasure today to kick off Session 3, Empowering Patients and Consumers. The forum offers an exciting opportunity for the public to view the unique scientific research and collaborative efforts of FDA's 11,000 scientists. You'll get to see firsthand how FDA's researchers are using novel science and technologies to inform FDA's regulatory decision-making efforts and also to empower patients and consumers. I'm very happy today to introduce our first speaker, Andrea Furia-Helms. Andrea?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Furia-Helms. I'm the Director of the Office of Patient Affairs in the Office of the Commissioner. I want to thank you for attending the FDA Science Forum today, and especially this session, Empowering Patients and Consumers. So I'm going to kick off the session with an overview and cover some ways the FDA empowers patients and their advocates to get involved in our regulatory activities. And then I'll end with some resources that might be helpful to you that you can use later on. We'll then hear from many of my distinguished colleagues about their work in patient and consumer empowerment. So first I want to start sharing about why we feel it's so important to hear patient perspectives and to incorporate it into our work in medical product development and the review process at FDA. Patients and caregivers and their advocates, they really provide insights on specific issues, things like their needs and priorities that are really important to them, but also their family members. Their perspectives provide a lot of diverse opinions and experiences, and these diverse opinions and experiences really shed light on issues such as risk tolerance and potential benefit. And also they provide really interesting perspectives on participating in clinical trials. But of course, there's something we really need to note, that they provide real, everyday experiences in real-world settings. And really, this reminds us of the human element. So really, patients are really at the heart of FDA's work and on all of our activities. So this is a busy slide, and it's not meant to really go through every detail, but it's really just to demonstrate that there's ongoing patient engagement activities at FDA. And even though it might seem that including patient perspectives in FDA's work has been something pretty recent, it really hasn't. It's been going on for over 30 years. While we might not be able to specifically pinpoint when patient engagement at FDA began, we do know there was an increase in engagement at the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis in the late 1980s. But since that time, involving patient stakeholders in our work has increased and evolved with many ways to get involved in FDA activities. And this involvement really helps FDA staff hear about various patient experiences and opinions. I'd like to talk a little bit about my office, Patient Affairs, like who we are and what we do. But before we get to that, I really want to talk a little bit more about the history. As I mentioned, there was an increase of engagement at the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis in the late 1980s. And in response to this, an office was established to interact and really build relationships with patients and their advocates, and specifically at that time, the HIV/AIDS community. Now that office then expanded to include oncology and then eventually all serious and life-threatening diseases and conditions. Over the years, the center-specific patient engagement offices and staff have established specific entities to work with patient communities. And that's because each medical product center has unique issues to the products they regulate. So Patient Affairs was established in late 2017 after a trans-FDA assessment on patient engagement activities determined a need for a cross-center effort at the commissioner level and really focusing on cross-cutting issues that go across the medical product centers. And we also are that initial entry point for patients who do not know where to begin in contacting the agency. So we work very closely with the medical product centers, as well as other offices, such as the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity. And we all work together to collaborate with patient communities, and we work to enhance patient engagement efforts. And ultimately, we're looking to make sure that that patient perspective is incorporated into FDA's work. So now I'm going to switch a little bit and talk about some of our activities in patient affairs and how we're incorporating patient perspectives in the work. So these are some of the programs and activities for incorporating perspectives. We have our patient listening sessions, our patient engagement collaborative, and all of this is really helping to enhance communications and how we have developed tools and resources to keep connected with patient communities and to encourage their participation in our activities. So I'll begin with the patient listening sessions. These sessions are one of the many ways that FDA is expanding patient involvement. They encourage communication between the patient community and FDA staff. Currently, the focus of the patient listening sessions are on rare diseases and are conducted in collaboration with our partners, the National Organization for Rare Disorders and the Reagan-Udall Foundation for FDA. So patient listening sessions allow FDA staff to engage with and hear experiences directly from patients, caregivers, and their advocates. And this is to help better inform medical product development and other regulatory issues. So just for example, listening sessions provide an understanding of things like disease and treatment burden, functionality and impact on daily activities, and priorities we should consider when developing medical products. But patient listening sessions also help educate review staff about rare diseases and other diseases and conditions. And just by participating in listening sessions, patients and their advocates get a better understanding of FDA's work and what our mission is. And this all provides a starting point to inform early stage research and development. So I want to talk a little bit about our Patient Engagement Collaborative. And this is a collaboration between the FDA and the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, also known as CITI. And this is through our public-private partnership. This, the PAC, as we call it, is comprised of an external group of patient organizations as well as individual representatives, and we explore topics about enhancing patient engagement in medical product development and other regulatory discussions at FDA. The PEC members decided they really wanted to focus on communications this time around, so they've been helping us improve our For Patients page, which is off of FDA.gov. And now we're working with them to help develop some educational resources for patient communities. And these resources are really to help patient communities to better understand FDA, what our role is, what we do, and how patients can get involved. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of communication tools and vehicles that we've developed to keep connected with patient communities. And we heard very loud and clear from our patient stakeholders that they were having some trouble finding information. So we've been working to enhance various means of communication. So I mentioned we're really working to further enhance our For Patients webpage with our PEC. We aim to be connected with patient communities through our Twitter handle. So we share important FDA safety announcements and other important updates for patients and their communities. We have an educational video series called Patients Matter, and this is to help educate patients and caregivers, better understand FDA and our programs, and of course how to get involved. And we also send targeted emails out to FDA about FDA-related communications that may be relevant to specific patient communities. I'm going to wrap up with the following slides on resources that I think might be helpful to you. So this slide is a resource of contacts and links if you're interested in seeking to learn more about the patient engagement programs and initiatives across the agency that you heard about today. As I mentioned, each of the medical product centers, that's the Center for Drugs, the Center for Biologics, and the Center for Devices, they have dedicated staff to patient engagement issues within their centers. So the medical product centers also host their own meetings with patients and patient groups. And then it was quite apparent from our stakeholder feedback, again, it wasn't so easy to know where to begin in contacting FDA. So we worked closely with our colleagues in the medical product centers in creating this web form, and it's for patients and advocates to submit inquiries or even meeting requests. It's called Patients Ask FDA. And so I encourage you to visit Patients Ask FDA if you have a specific question or are interested in meeting with FDA on a specific topic related to a disease or condition. And finally, this is the Office of the Patient Affairs team and how to contact us. So feel free to reach out anytime. We're always here to help, and thank you for your attention. I'll turn it back over to Christine.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was very informative, and thank you so much for those resources. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Susan Winkler. Please go ahead, Susan.
Thanks so much, and I appreciate the opportunity to join you today. I'm Susan Winkler, and I serve as CEO at the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA, which is the nonprofit that was established by Congress solely to advance the mission of the agency. And as noted by Andrea, we do a fair amount of work related to listening sessions, and I'm going to talk about the project we did with listening sessions to uncover patient questions related to a COVID-19 vaccine and specifically develop or advance confidence there. So I want to start a bit and remind us why we need to think about vaccine hesitancy. We know that we are deep in a mass vaccination campaign, and individuals bring different levels of motivation and interest to that campaign. While these graphs are a few weeks old, representing when our slides were due, they show that we can make a difference. Here you see a decline in the hesitancy in each of these categories. And as of today, reports are that 50% of the population is fully vaccinated against COVID-19, but we still have a ways to go. This is just a different way of looking at that same data and showing it by race and ethnicity. But again, underscores that we can decrease hesitancy, but need to do more. The next one I'll just do as a stage setter. This was some work that was done recently to help articulate, now that we're into the COVID-19 vaccine, where are there pockets of high rates of vaccine willingness versus low rates of vaccine willingness. And this is the type of information that's important to monitor as we continue in the campaign, to say where do we have those populations who are more or less willing to get a vaccine, so that we can reach them not only with awareness efforts, but by being willing to have conversations and answer the questions that they may have about a COVID-19 vaccine. So what's interesting here, we'll just call out, you have high rates of vaccine willingness among those 65 and older with high income, as compared to low rates of vaccine willingness with the younger in the 18 to 34-year-olds with low income. So you may be using different types of messengers there, and as well as different types of messages. So that was just a reminder of why we would need to do this work. And now I want to go back and talk about a project that we were honored to conduct with FDA's Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. This was a project to gather concerns and develop messages, but it wasn't a communications campaign. Rather, it gathered the concerns to then develop the key content for messaging and communication material. If we think about the importance of FDA as a communicator, it was a privilege to partner with CBER on this work, thinking ahead to what could be said when the vaccines were made available. So that gets to a bit of the timing here. We did this project last fall, so before there were any vaccines available, and did it in a 4-stage approach. We began in August with a landscape analysis. So we reviewed what was being said in the media and what concerns were being raised, so that when we would go into listening sessions, we had at least a sense of where the conversation might go. Then in September and October, we conducted 14 listening sessions, and we targeted traditionally underrepresented populations, so Black and Brown, and then essential workers in retail and in healthcare. So we partnered with different community groups to go to those groups across the country, and so we had listening sessions in various areas across the country, and some were virtual, some were in person, but sitting down with these individuals to gather those concerns. Then we took what we had heard in those listening sessions and developed messages to respond to the concerns that were raised. And then our final point was to do some message testing to say, okay, we listened to you. We have developed messages to respond to your concerns. Now let's test whether those messages are relevant and credible, and then provided this entire package of information to FDA for incorporation into their work, as well as provided it to a number of different organizations. So I'll pause here to note that the listening sessions were powerful, illuminating, and sobering. In each of these sessions, a moderator led the attendees through a set of questions about, at the time, what were potential COVID-19 vaccines. We heard some enthusiasm and a lot of questions, and we could never communicate as powerfully as these individuals did themselves. There are a few quotes on this page from those individuals. I should note that the moderators in these sessions did not answer questions nor provide any education. They were simply facilitating the discussion. But some of these were just truly powerful and shared that there were concerns about how quickly things were moving, but to say, for example, I'll read one of the quotes, "I need to know that all the minorities who took it are okay. I need to know it works for everybody. I am not trying to be harmed." And so there was really helpful information. We shared many of these quotes with the Vaccine Advisory Committee in October, so they too could get a better understanding of what it was that people were thinking about as it related to a COVID-19 vaccine. We took those direct comments and all of that rich content then and put that into themes. And so we could capture the themes from those listening sessions in three categories. So there was concern about vaccine development, about the speed of the process and its effect on vaccine quality, fear that the vaccine would not work for me, for my family, for my community. There were concerns about the vaccine review and approval or authorization process, with a consistent theme of distrust of government and a lack of transparency, and concern that economics and politics would be prioritized over science. And then a third theme was based on the historical and current structural defects in our healthcare system, the real disparities that individuals continue to face or have faced in the past. Now, this third theme isn't readily addressed by a message, but it does provide important information for healthcare systems, those who are working on vaccine confidence, to understand that reminding them of the reality of the experience of some of their patients, and then to reminding us all to continue to take steps to address the current disparities. So going through our process, we then developed messages to respond to these major themes. And the messages that performed best in our polls, as well as then with some revision based on conversations with experts, are presented here. And they're intended to be clear, They're not what I would say is rocket science, but it's helpful to know that people wanted to know that FDA was going to be publicly sharing information so you could see the evidence for yourself. That only safe and effective COVID-19 vaccines that had been rigorously tested would be approved. That it would be scientists and career public health officials who would decide when a COVID-19 vaccine was safe, effective, and ready for public use. And one here that was important, we tested different ways of saying how getting a vaccine might protect you or others. And what resonated most in the poll were those that were personal, that said, it's protecting myself, my children, and my parents, my grandparents. The idea of a community benefit wasn't very motivating, but the idea that I could help people around me was. And then that the vaccine development was moving faster than normal because it was a high priority, not because any steps had been skipped. We then put those messages in a package to say that when using these messages, it's really important to first listen to the questions that an individual might have and then respond to their questions with personalized responses, and to explain the process and never shaming. So if it's a question about the speed of development, the answer should not be, don't worry, we've got it. It should be, here's how we went quickly, and here's some information, and continue a dialogue is one of the best ways to respond to that hesitancy and help individuals make a decision about whether or not to receive a vaccine. We also tested who should provide these messages. And what's really interesting here is that we probably aren't surprised that a local doctor, nurse, or pharmacist was seen as very credible in responding to questions about a COVID-19 vaccine, along with health experts and the FDA. Those who were not seen as folks who were trusted in responding to questions or concerns were celebrities, and by a dramatic margin. Now, that's not to say celebrities can be helpful in providing awareness, but for those who have questions about a vaccine, they want to hear from an individual who has training and who they trust and who is in their community and has a basis for answering those questions. So this was one of the most striking results of the poll, was who should speak to questions when trying to address vaccine hesitancy, and that you'll see there that 70-point difference between my doctor or my nurse or my pharmacist or a celebrity. We then, and this is a bit of an eye chart, but as we were helping folks thinking through, all right, we know we need the local doctor, nurse, and pharmacist to be able to answer these questions. That question about the time to how did we get a vaccine so fast was one that we also heard from healthcare professionals, and they needed to better understand how did we possibly get there. So this is an infographic that's hard to see on a slide, but is available on the Foundation's website, that at the top lays out the normal vaccine development process and the different stages with different colors. And then in the pandemic shows how all of those same steps were taken. They were simply taken in a staged manner, so that some of them being more concurrent versus consecutive, and so that things could move so much more quickly. And so this has been helpful for healthcare professionals, because if they're going to be asked questions by the vaccine hesitant, they need to have the information to be able to respond to those questions, as well as to others who are trying to explain and understand how all of this happened so quickly. So you'll see here we have the focus on the research that it was building on work that had been done before the pandemic, that the manufacturing was being done at the same time as the clinical trials, and that the clinical trials were were running certainly with overlap so that you didn't have a gap between those times, and then that the FDA review process was conducted so very quickly, and then to show you have the distribution, as well as this really important point to a number of folks in our listening sessions was the ongoing monitoring, that once a vaccine was being made available, that there would be continuous monitoring to assess the performance of the vaccine, which we've obviously seen the results of that in some of the actions that have been taken, as well as our extending our understanding of vaccines. So we were so pleased to help FDA focus on a communications component of their work, particularly being done before the vaccines were even available, so that when they were made available, the agency could be well armed with content and advice on how best to respond to individuals and their questions. And with that, Christine, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was incredibly informative. I'm happy to introduce our third speaker, Jessica Weinberg. Jessica?
Thank you, Christine. Just start my webcam. All right. Hi, my name is Jessica Weinberg, and I am a social science analyst for the Patient Science and Engagement Program at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the Food and Drug Administration. I'll be presenting today on a project conducted with the University of Maryland to understand perceptions, attitudes, and beliefs towards COVID-19 testing and participation in national databases in underrepresented populations. The goal of this project was to develop accurate and meaningful communication about COVID-19 testing, specifically to underrepresented populations. What we learned from this study will help CDRH tailor our health messages and inform our efforts for monitoring COVID-19 spread. We partnered with the University of Maryland Center for Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation, or CIRSE, to conduct this effort. Through their patients program, they have deep ties to the community, which helped us to conduct this community-based participatory research. We had members of the community participate as partners in the research advisory group. These community advisors helped recruit patients and allowed for more transparent conversations. Having these patient advisors improves the quality of our data collection and can help empower residents to use the data in their community. Within the FDA, we worked with the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity and multiple offices within CDRH, including experts in diagnostics, communications, and regulatory science. We conducted virtual focus groups and key informant interviews from October through December 2020. We began this study when tests were in short supply and there was resistance from some groups to being tested. There were no vaccines available for prevention of COVID-19 at the time of the study, and testing was a key to prevention. We focused on 6 populations, including African Americans, Spanish speakers, older adults, people with lower literacy and health literacy, people with chronic conditions, and asymptomatic individuals living with someone who tested positive for COVID-19. These populations were chosen as those who were vulnerable during the pandemic and groups for whom we would like to reduce barriers to testing. Data was collected until saturation was achieved, and a qualitative software application, in vivo, was used to analyze the data. And of course, as luck would have it, my dog is barking during the presentation, so please excuse any interruptions. I'll be going into the results next. Findings that emerged from focus groups include perceived testing benefits, concerns, and results. Themes also included attitudes towards sharing data in and sponsorship of national databases and suggestions for communicating about COVID-19 testing and participation in databases. Participants were knowledgeable about COVID-19 and its public health impact. They had personal, family, and friend experiences with COVID-19, and these spanned from mild to severe cases, including deaths, as you can see by the first quote on this slide. Some benefits of testing they mentioned included public protection, relieving personal fears and uncertainty, and the ability to manage mild and moderate cases of COVID-19 early on to prevent severe complications. One participant stated that it would make them feel safer if you got tested frequently, as you can see in the second quote. Participants shared that the desire to protect family and friends would motivate them to get tested. Some stated that they would be motivated by close contact with a person who tested positive for COVID-19, or if they themselves contracted COVID-19 symptoms. And they also said that it would help if there were better community-focused messages around the importance of testing. While some participants shared their perceptions of the benefits of testing, many discussed their concerns about testing. Participants' concerns about testing varied, with some citing uncomfortable testing methods, like nasal swabs, holding them off from getting tested. One participant stated, "I think they need to have other ways of doing the testing. I would be scared to take the test because it is up the nose and through the mouth, like sticking a Q-tip down your throat." The idea of repeated testing was controversial among the groups. Some participants were willing to take multiple tests, while others were very opposed to the idea, with some describing the discomfort of the test as the main reason. They also discussed fears that they may contract the virus at the testing site, as they'd be surrounded by others who may potentially be sick, and others stated that the time between taking the test and receiving the results is a window for spreading the virus silently. In addition to concerns, participants raised factors that would hinder their ability to take the test. One of the main hindering factors that participants raised included geographical locations and transportation to testing sites, with many sites being too far from their home. Another logistical hindering factor raised was the long wait time that would take them away from home and from work. They also mentioned familial responsibilities, making it hard for them to get away to get tested. And they discussed the direct and indirect financial consequences of positive test results impacting them and their families, as you can see by the quote on this slide. Other psychological factors included the stigma of COVID-19 testing and the fear of COVID-19 complications and mortality. Participants discussed their impressions about getting testing results, saying that the results themselves were easy to understand, but it was hard to figure out what to do if you got positive. If you tested positive. They also questioned the reliability, sensitivity, and specificity of the test, which made them not necessarily trust the test results. Participants raised several concerns about their perceptions and attitudes towards sharing their data in national databases. They wanted the data to be de-identified to protect themselves against discrimination, including from their insurance companies. You can see two quotes to that effect on this slide. Some participants also said they thought their data was already being shared, even if they weren't informed of it. They generally supported sharing testing data for research purposes and the benefit of the public if they fully understood what was being done with their data. They stated that requesting permission and providing informed consent was important to them. Participants also had opinions about data ownership. The strongest resistance expressed was to using government-sponsored databases, and they raised issues about government surveillance, historical exploitation of marginalized groups, and potential improper usages of data. There was moderate hesitance to contributing testing data to pharmaceutical or medical device companies. They saw limited benefits to themselves or their communities and expressed concerns about the economic exploitation of data for profit. They felt most comfortable sharing data with research organizations, who they saw as providing a greater good. There was still some resistance to contributing to this group, but much less than with sharing with the government or pharmaceutical or medical device companies. They also provided suggestions to the FDA about how to best communicate about testing. They shared that it was important to disseminate trustworthy and transparent information about COVID-19 testing, and that community-based and culturally sensitive sources should be used to disseminate COVID-19 testing information. They discussed that the FDA could implement clear, multifaceted, fact-based information sharing to promote the importance of COVID-19 testing in their communities, and that a similar approach could be taken to clear up misinformation surrounding testing in their communities, as you can see by the first quote on this slide. While participants suggested this for FDA, this is a consideration for all federal and state public health agencies. For communicating about participation in national databases, they suggested being transparent about how the data would be used, sharing results and information back with communities, and being consistent in messaging about contributing data to national databases. They also discussed concerns that COVID-19 data and efforts to tackle the disease were politically influenced. These findings will be helpful to the FDA as we continue to promote testing as one element to contain the spread of COVID-19. So in summary, there are barriers to getting tested, as we elicited in our focus groups. Some of these barriers may have improved since the beginning of the study. These patient populations do want information about testing and are willing to share their information in national databases, with a preference for databases that are run by academic research centers. Additionally, it's important to provide clear communication about what to do when the test result is positive, and participants wanted communication materials to be clear, transparent, and accessible to diverse audiences. And finally, I've listed some resources and contact information for you to reach out if you'd like more information. Thank you for your attention and bearing with me and my dog for this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I think your little puppy wanted to join in on the conversation. Thank you so much.
She sure did.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Yu Qing. Yu Qing, do you want to go ahead?
Thanks so much. My name is Yu-Qing Chen. I am team lead in the PASS branch, Office of Science at CTP. Today I'll be presenting the latest finding from the PASS study on cigarette and electronic nicotine delivery systems, the end use among adults age 20 and above, and association between COVID-19 and tobacco use on behalf of this PASS study team. I will begin with an overview of the population assessment of tobacco and health study, the PASS study, and then share with you two data collection efforts, WAVE 5.5 and adult telephone survey that occurred in year 2020, and then share with you some data from the PASS study. PASS study is a longitudinal cohort study of tobacco use, its determinants, and its impact. It's national representative of U.S. civilian non-institutionalized population age 12 and above. The WAVE 1 include about 46,000 participants, and we have adult use pairing instrument to collect tobacco use information. We also have biospecimen collected. The study is funded by CTP and is administered by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. One of the strengths of the PASS study is its longitudinal design, which allows us to look at tobacco use and changes over time, including initiation, cessation, and relapse, polyuse, switching, addiction and dependence, and the health condition or exposure related to the tobacco product. And then we are also able to look at how tobacco product evolve as the regulatory activities or environment changes. And then we have this example in year 2020 when the COVID-19 happened. The PASS study was launched in 2011. The first wave of data collection began in 2013. Through 2019, we have complete 5 main waves of data collection. And then in year 2020, we have 2 special data collection, WAVE 5.5 and ATS, which I'll be telling you more in later slides. And we're currently in the field of WAVE 6 data collection. So next, I'm going to give you an update on the 2 special data collection that PASS did and how PASS study adapt during the time of COVID-19. The first one is WAVE 5.5. WAVE 5.5 was a special data collection of young people aged between 13 and 19. The original design was to collect the data in person, and then the field work started in December 2019, but it was put on hiatus after the onset of a pandemic. Through a lot of planning, WAVE 5.5 was relaunched in July 2020 using telephone data collection mode only. Some additional COVID questions were added in the relaunch, and samples were refilled in a way to provide a national representative estimate of tobacco use and health among young people in 2020. In addition to Wave 5.5, PATH study was able to quickly add an adult telephone survey, ATS, to generate information on tobacco use of adults 20 and above, which complement the Wave 5.5 data collection post the onset of COVID-19. The ATS data was planned, fielded, and collected in the later half of the 2020, and data collection was complete last December. The data I'm presenting today, including some preliminary data collected from September to November 2020. Preliminary waves were used to construct the estimates, and all results were presented by two age groups, young adults 20 to 24 and older adults 25 and above. The first set of results I'll be sharing with you is the preference of cigarette and ENDS use from 2013 to 2020. Among young adults aged 20 to 24, we see a decline in cigarette use across waves, and then this is seen across all different use measures, and then especially you can see that we see a decrease from Wave 5 to ATS. Among older adults, we see that average use of cigarette use is relatively stable over time. But again, for past 12-month use, past 30-day use, and daily use, we see a decrease from Wave 5 collected from 2018 to 19, and then from Wave 5 to ATS collected in 2020. Among ENDS user, among young adults, the average use of ENDS increased over time. And then for past 12 months use and past 30 days use, you can see that we see an increase from Wave 4 to Wave 5, but then it decreased from Wave 5 to ATS. For daily use, we see a slight increase from Wave 5 to ATS. Among ENDS use, among older adults, for ENDS use, for past 12 months use and past 30-day use, we also see a decrease from Wave 5 to ATS. However, the estimates for every use and daily use are relatively stable from Wave 5 to ATS. I'm sorry, I think some of the figures are not showing up properly in the slides. All right, we're also looking at a closer look at the device type used by the ENDS users. Among ENDS past 30-day user in young adults, we see a sharp increase in the use of disposable device, the blue bar, from Wave 5 to ATS. And in 2020, the disposable device became the most common device type used by the young adults, followed closely by non-refillable cartridges device type, and the refillable system. The refillable system including the tank and the mask system. Among older adults, in year 2020, the refillable system and then the cartridges device type remain the most common device type used by older adults. We were also able to look at some of the initial transition data of cigarette use and ENDS use from Wave 5 to ATS. First, we'll look at exclusive past 30-day cigarette use, and then they're at Wave 5, and then their tobacco use status roughly a year later. Similarly, we also look at exclusive ENDS user at Wave 5, and then their tobacco use roughly a year later at ATS. And in general, a majority of the exclusive cigarette user continue to be exclusive stick user roughly a year later. About 30 to 40% of the exclusive ENDS user continue to be exclusive ENDS user a year later. We see a small proportion, roughly 12% of young adults and 4% of the exclusive older adult exclusive cigarette user who become poly using of both cigarette and ENDS at ATS. And about 7 to 9% of exclusive ENDS user become poly using of both products at ATS. We also look at what happened to the poly cigarette and end user from wave 5 to ATS. Overall, among wave 5 poly cigarette and end user, roughly 1/3 of the adults continue to be poly users roughly a year later. However, the transition from poly use to exclusive cigarette use seems to be more common among older adults than young adults. We see 37% of the older adults who are poly user versus 8.4% of young adults who are poly user transition to be exclusive cigarette users. In contrast, the transition from poly use to exclusive end use seems to be more common in young adults. We see 17% of young adults and 8.5% of the older adults who made this transition. Lastly, we'll also look at some of the association between COVID-19 and tobacco use. We first look at the self-report changes in cigarette or end use after the start of COVID-19. The cigarette use is on the left, the end use is on the right. As you can see that most of the current cigarette user and most of the end user report that they use about the same amount compared to before the start of COVID-19, which is shown in the purple bar here. But there are about 17 to 30% of the cigarette user and the 10 to 20% of the end user report that they use less than before the start of COVID. And we also look at the self-report COVID effect on quitting cigarette or end. More than 70% of the cigarette user indicate that COVID has no impact on their quit intention of cigarettes. And more than 80% of the end user indicate that COVID-19 has no impact on their end use. In summary, we see a decrease in past 30-day use of cigarette and ends in adults from wave 5 to ATS, and there's a sharp increase in the disposable device type for young adults, but refillable device type remain the most common end product for older adults in 2020. And the transition pattern seems to be different by young adult and older adults. And lastly, a majority of the cigarette end user indicate COVID-19 has no impact on their intention to quit, but we do see some proportion report that they use less than before. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yu-Chin. That was extremely informative. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Christine Mueller. Christine?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I'm Christine Mueller. I'm a medical officer in the FDA Office of Orphan Products Development, or OOPD. Today, I'll start with the background about OOPD and the office grants program administered by the office, and then I'll discuss the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the program and supported studies. The mission of OOPD is to advance the evaluation and development of products including drugs, biologics, medical devices, and medical foods that demonstrate promise for the diagnosis and or treatment of rare diseases and special populations. OOPD has several programs that provide incentives to support rare disease product development that include the 3 designation programs listed here. We also administer 3 grant programs. I'll focus on the clinical trials and natural history grants programs today. OOPD grants program was established back in 1983 to fund clinical trials to defray the costs of developing medical products for rare diseases. At that time, there was really little interest in investment in rare disease treatments, as there was little to gain for companies in developing products for such small patient populations. Our grants support both academic and industry-sponsored research, domestic or foreign, public or private, for-profit or nonprofit entities. A main criteria of eligibility for the program is that the disease being studied must be rare as defined in the U.S. Orphan Drug Act as affecting less than 200,000 persons in the U.S. This program is competitive yet practical and unique. The goal of the program is really to advance marketing approvals to help get treatments to patients, but we also support publications and guidelines that impact the care of patients with rare diseases. Being in the FDA makes our grants program unique in that OOPD staff bring various expertise in regulatory product development, and it really allows us to use our relationship with the centers to ensure their appropriate input into studies, and that what we fund is not only a good research study, but focuses on drug development, that it will lead to an indication change or a new approval. Since 1983, we've reviewed over 2,800 applications and provided over $440 million of funding for over 750 rare disease studies. We have a really great success rate with about 95% of funded studies being completed. Currently, our annual budget's about $17.7 million, which we spend on both the clinical trials and natural history grants program. The clinical trials grants program was the initial program established back in 1983 to help provide incentives for researchers to study treatments for rare diseases. Even today, although there's more focus on rare diseases, of the over 7,000 known, only a few hundred have approved treatments. The program currently has an annual budget of about $15.5 million with the goal of supporting the development of products where no current therapy exists or where the product will be superior to the existing therapy. At any one time, there are about 60 to 85 ongoing clinical trials. The majority, 55% that we support have been phase 2 studies, about a quarter have been phase 1, and 20% have been phase 3. About half of our grantees are academic researchers who also have collaborations with companies, and about 25% of our grantees are companies that do tend to be small and focusing on rare disease research. The majority of products that we've supported, 71%, have been for drugs, about a quarter for biologics, and we've also supported medical devices and medical foods at smaller percentages. The program's been quite successful over the years and has led to over 75 FDA-approved products that were at least partially funded by us for over 85 indications. That means about 10% of our funded studies have been used towards a marketing approval. And here are some examples of approved products that have been supported by the program that you can see really include a wide range of rare diseases and types of products. The Natural History Grants Program was launched in 2016 after hearing a great need for good quality natural history studies in rare diseases and continually seeing natural history related specific aims added to our clinical trials grant applications that really lacked needed focus and funding. The budget for these studies is about $2 million a year. The initial funding opportunity goal was to support studies that advance rare disease medical product development through the characterization of the disease. And 2018's revised funding opportunity focused on efficient and innovative studies that also included patient and caregiver perspectives. We've funded 8 natural history studies to date. In 2017, we co-funded 2 of those with NIH. And as you can see, these studies are for a variety of rare diseases as well and are being done at academic centers across the country, many involving multiple sites. And looking at our last round of applications to really get an idea of how to improve the impact of the program, we saw, as with our funded studies, that the applications being submitted were mostly by academics. The most common main goals were to study disease progression and biomarker development, with a range of others that you can see here, which were really in line with our goal of advancing treatments for rare diseases with a focus on patient and caregiver perspectives. Now that I've provided a background of our grants programs, I'll talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on our studies and our response. We began hearing concerns from our grantees early on about study progress due to the pandemic at the onset in March 2020. We started tracking those issues really early on as well, that our studies were having and how our grantees were addressing them, such as study suspensions, study completion delays or terminations, informed consent changes, protocol deviations, study endpoints that weren't being assessed, protocol amendments that were required, monitoring changes that were required, either adding or dropping sites, product issues, travel issues, loss of patients due to disease progression, and budget implications because of the pandemic. Of 71 of our ongoing grants, 63 clinical trials and 8 natural history studies, 79% had some effect due to the pandemic. And as can be seen here, many studies stopped enrolling new patients and are following patients already on study as per protocol at one or more of their sites based on the effects of the pandemic, either geographically, the kind of study being done, and institutional needs related to the pandemic in terms of staffing, supplies, or study procedures. A number of studies added virtual capabilities, had budget implications, or travel issues related to the pandemic as well. Really enrolling, completing rare disease studies is already challenging on many fronts, including due to small patient populations. And in working with our grantees during the pandemic, we have been looking at preserving time, invested resources, the effort of participants already enrolled or completed in studies, and really successfully completing studies with flexibility in mind where appropriate. Early on, we provided our grantees with the FDA guidance on the conduct of clinical trials of medical products during the COVID-19 pandemic, which was issued last March and has been updated several times, including our question and answer section. The safety of trial participants and study staff is really the most important factor that we're considering by avoiding or limiting potential exposures to COVID-19, avoiding interference with clinical care for COVID-19, and continuing study activities perhaps virtually or in person where feasible when benefits greater than risk. We've encouraged our grantees to consider their circumstances with a focus on the potential impact on study participant safety, while doing their best to also minimize impacts to the integrity of the study in collaboration with our project officers and their respective FDA Medical Product Center review divisions. To better help them navigate those challenges, we've also held 2 Grantee Unite meetings to facilitate discussions with each other because they all have varying expertise and come from across the country and world about issues that they face with their studies and ways they work to address their challenges. The topics they discussed included decisions related to what factors grantees were considering in reopening enrollment, challenges in multi-center studies where enrollment continued at some sites and not others, what study processes were being performed at a distance for current or new enrollees, and how really protocol deviations or changes were being managed. We also issued an administrative supplement request to our currently funded grantees to provide additional funding based on unexpected costs they had due to the pandemic to facilitate safe conduct and completion of their studies. We awarded 4 supplements totaling $350,000 to date, and they've been used for additional personnel and lab study costs, computational informatics and telecommunication costs required for remote visits, a cloud-based imaging platform, and IRB and startup fees for newly added sites. We do expect to award additional funds to others in fiscal year 2021. The key strategies for us throughout the pandemic have really been communication, documentation, and flexibility. We've done that by providing supplemental funds, tracking the issues that our grantees have had with their studies during the pandemic, providing them with the guidance issued by FDA, and encouraging communication with us, our FDA review division colleagues, their institutions, DSMBs, IRBs, study participants, and each other. In doing so, we've seen how quickly study modifications have been able to be made with flexibility based on things like site locations, the disease at hand, and its risks in and of itself or related to COVID, the study design, or the product being studied. And of course, documentation by all as to decision-making throughout the pandemic will be important in maintaining compliance with GCP and minimizing risk to trial and integrity. A working group has been formed from the discussions with our grantees through our Unite meetings, and we continue to monitor the impact of the pandemic on our grants as the landscape changes over time. Looking ahead, we've continued to make changes to the grants program over the last year to increase their impact, promote innovation, and learn from the past. We've issued new requests for funding opportunities with a focus on efficiency, innovation, collaboration, patient input, data quality and interpretability, and leveraging of resources and funding. A large need really remains for funding in the rare disease space, and we'll continue to work together with academia and industry, other funders, and patients and caregivers to bring new treatments to rare disease patients. Thank you all, and here's some contact information for our office. Please reach out if you have questions about our programs.
Thank you so much, Christine, for such a great presentation. Our next speaker is Wilson Bryan. Welcome, Wilson.
Thank you, Christine. I'm Wilson Bryan. I'm Director of the Office of Tissues and Advanced Therapies, or OTAT, in the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, or CBER. And I'd like to say a few words about the effect that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on ongoing clinical trials. And this will echo some of the things that you've heard from previous speakers. First, for those of you who are not familiar with the Center for Biologics, our Center Director is Dr. Peter Marks and Deputy Director Dr. Celia Witten. On this graph, the 3 boxes across the bottom of the graph show the offices that are tied to specific types of products. First on the left, the Office of Vaccines, or OVRR, which has been obviously extremely involved in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Then next to that, the Office of Blood Research and Review, OBRR, which has been regulating blood products, and of course also regulates convalescent plasma relevant to the pandemic. And then highlighted in yellow, my office, not because it's highlighted not because it's actually larger or more important, but simply because it's the office that I work in. And OTAT regulates a wide variety of products, and we've been particularly active during the pandemic. Now this actually this graph shows our activity over the last number of decades, and these are the number of research investigational new drug applications, or research INDs. And when I use the term research INDs, I mean to distinguish these INDs that are for clinical development of a product to come on the market as a therapeutic, to distinguish those INDs from expanded access INDs, single patient INDs, emergency use INDs that are more about treatment of individual patients. These INDs are what we usually think of as doing clinical trials for research to provide evidence of safety and effectiveness to get a product on the market. Circled in red there are the numbers of research INDs received at the FDA in the Office of Tissue and Advanced Therapies. In 2016, we received 163. By 2020, that number had more than doubled. So a rapid increase in activity, and that reflects the excitement about some of our products. Particularly, most of these INDs are for the development of cell therapies and gene therapies. Let's look first at cell therapies and the number of INDs for cell therapies. And the first circle there shows that in 2016 we received 63 research INDs for cell therapy, and that has continued to increase slowly through 2019 when we had 91. And then in 2020 there's this huge jump. In 1 year we went from 91 to 151 research INDs for cell therapies. And this reflects the interest in cellular products and cellular-derived products for the treatment of COVID-19. Now, this rapid increase that occurred during the pandemic for cell therapies is contrasted with what we saw for gene therapies. This graph shows the number of research INDs for gene therapy. The first circle shows 2016. We had 67 research INDs for gene therapy. And then 3 years later, in 2019, that number had more than doubled to 161. This rapid increase leveled off and basically stopped in 2020. With the pandemic, the number of gene therapy INDs received in 2020 was 160, basically the same numbers received in the previous year. So while cell therapy INDs increased dramatically during the pandemic, the gene therapy INDs showed no change from the previous year. And this reflects, I think, largely the challenge of doing clinical trials, and particularly clinical trials that involve viral vectors during the pandemic. So what happened to ongoing clinical trials during the pandemic? Well, there had to be some modifications. The modifications occurred for several reasons. First of all, there's the risk of COVID-19. Study subjects were concerned, and study investigators were concerned about patients having to come to study sites, and the risk of travel, the risk of exposure during the actual visits to the study site. So the risk of COVID-19 forced us to rethink how the ongoing trials were being done. The pandemic increased the expense of these ongoing trials. Everything slowed down with the pandemic. Harder to get patients into the study sites, fewer patients being enrolled, the physicians occupied with other priorities other than their clinical trials, and the expense of the clinical trials increased dramatically. And then on the positive side, physicians and patients became much more comfortable with telemedicine. And telemedicine was seen as a means to address some of the challenges of the pandemic. And wearable devices that patients could wear to monitor their activities and perhaps be used to monitor safety and effectiveness of therapeutics. So some of the trial conduct changes were in recruitment and enrollment. Patients not willing to come for clinic visits, basically scared about coming for clinic visits so that they couldn't be examined to see if they were eligible for clinical trials. Recruitment and enrollment slowed down. Informed consent became a challenge, and the FDA put out guidance on how to do informed consent remotely and how to be sure that patients are appropriately informed about the risks and potential benefits of a clinical trial. So recruitment and enrollment changed dramatically and slowed dramatically during the pandemic. Monitoring of subjects, again, very much went to remote monitoring because patients could not travel, could not take the risks of travel and the risks of site visits. And the endpoints that were being used for clinical trials often had to be changed. Some endpoints, some primary, secondary, or exploratory endpoints are really dependent upon the doctor doing an in-person examination, and clinical trials had to look and say, well, which endpoints are sustainable through telemedicine and remote visits? And sometimes there had to be rearrangements of which endpoints were primary or secondary. And we were very open to those sorts of changes. In some cases, because of the challenges of doing clinical trials, sponsors proposed to decrease the sample size, perhaps use an interim analysis as the basis for the overall study results. We were very concerned about this proposal, and because it often means decreasing study power and making the study less likely to provide interpretable results. In addition, some sponsors wanted to change the duration of the study. Instead of following patients for 6 months or following patients for a year or 2 years, they wanted to decrease the study duration to 6 months, for example. And we were hesitant to endorse these sorts of changes because these changes would likely leave us with endpoints that were not clinically meaningful. And as you can imagine, the challenges of missing data increased dramatically during the pandemic. But there were a few lessons learned and things that we can take forward. First of all, we think that telemedicine and wearable devices will really be useful, particularly for rare diseases where there are patients scattered around the world who are enrolled in clinical trials. So we think that the future of clinical trials will really incorporate a lot of telemedicine and wearable devices. And we were very pleased with the FDA's ability to put out guidance documents at a rapid pace. The FDA put out scores of guidance documents relevant to the pandemic, and we hope that there will be some lessons learned on how we can continue to be proactive in communicating with our stakeholders through guidances. And I will put my contact information up there for just a second as we turn it back over to Christine, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Wilson, for such a great presentation. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Hong Feng. Welcome, Hong Feng.
Hi, thank you, Christina, for hosting.
Can you hear me? It seems like my camera has some problem. Let me just reconnect it.
Yes, we can hear you, Hong.
Can you see me? Hello?
We can't see you, but we can hear you. Please continue.
Okay, I'll go on continue. And my name is Hong Fong. I'm from Office of Scientific Coordination, National Center for Toxicology Research at FDA. My topic today is FDA label database and FDA drug labeling search tool. I would like you to pay attention to the disclaimer. This presentation is my personal view, and any mention of commercial products is for clarification and is not as intended as an endorsement. And the first of all, I would like to have an overview about the FDA label. And the FDA label is a web-based database for managing, query, and organizing drug labeling and other product and other product labeling. The data source is from FDA structured product labeling for human and animal product and prescription and the non-prescription drug and the biological product. We can download the data from the public domain like DNMed. And currently the database contains over 135,000 labeling and updated bi-weekly. We designed a user-friendly interface and search against the entire text of the drug labeling. And also we built an advanced query feature to allow for the translation on regulatory science, such as we integrate our database with drugs at FDA and Orange Book, integrated with Major Medical Dictionary for regulatory activities. Also, we integrated with the pharmacological class and integrated with Global Substance Registry System, which allowed chemical search, chemical structure search, and substance search. And this cartoon shows you the earlier version of the FDA label have some simple search. Then later on, we integrate with the standard and the other database. Then currently, we expanded to more standards to allow a user to easy to query the information in the drug labeling database. So today, my talk will focus on the prescription drug labeling. And what is the prescription drug labeling? It is including prescribing information, and people also say drug label. It contains a summary of essential scientific information needed for the safe and effective use of the drug. It includes approved condition of use, its indication, dosage, safety information, and so on. And the number of the sections and subsections and length of the prescription information vary from 4 to 100 page length. And this screenshot and show you one of the example of the drug labeling table of content. And this drug called Menchoklid. And it indicated for the treatment of adults and a pediatric patient with solid tumor that has a neutral NTRK gene fusion. And this gene has a FDA companion diagnostic approved for patients who has a NTRK gene verified. So this is a typical personalized medicine. So this slide is quite busy. And this slide is a try to illustrate drug development process and along with what information has feed into the drug labeling. So in the top line is a drug development process, which is a long process, could take 10
15 years. And the second layer is the information which is generated from this development processing. And this information eventually can be fed into the drug labeling. So the approved condition of the use of the drug are summarized in the prescribing information. And the FDA label allowed us to present to users, public users, such as patients and healthcare professionals, to query the information in this labeling information, including all those sections. And FDA approved the prescription drug labeling actually prepared by a manufacturer and approved by FDA. The data is from preclinical and clinical trial, as we show, and updating with post-market case report. And the format and the content of the prescribing information actually specified CFR Title 21. And there's many regulations around this particular content and format of labeling information. So if you want to see the detail, please go to our prescription drug labeling resource. And I will have no time for the detail here. So our FDA label database is designed to query a complex structure of the drug label, then allowed a flexible, powerful, and fast search engine to search against the entire text. And the query text within any specific combination of the drug name, section, subsection, and pharmacological class, etc. And exported the result, labeling result, to a spreadsheet to allow you open in the Excel to further data analysis. And also the direct link can be linked to the SPL document, DNMED, drugs at FDA, and Orange Book, and so on, the product information. So the customized query and the results can be repeated, saved, and shared with other users for later view and updating. So you can repeat it and reproduce the very complicated query. And this is a screenshot of the FDA label, and it's currently the version 2.5. You can get in the Amazon Web Service. We also call it Amazon Cloud. And so the database is available in our Bioinformatics 2 page. So you can search by FDA label or search by Bioinformatics 2. You can get this database. The database arranged the information I mentioned. So with each of the box with labeling information. And for example, the labeling section has a pull-down menu, including all the sections, including the labeling. And this is another example of the screenshot about the labeling information called highlights. This half page of the concise summary of labeling major sections is highlighted in the half page, and which is captured essential information in the top of the drug labeling. And this example is approved drug product remdesivir and is treated for the approved for treatment of COVID-19. And so I highlight this indication and usage. So you can see this remdesivir is indicated for adults and the pediatric patient 12 years of age and older and weigh at least 40 kg. So the same drug has emergency use authorization. Regarding the EUA up-to-date information, please go to EUA official web page. And this EUA is expanded age to less than 12 years old and the weight at least 35 kg. And here I give you another example. You can find our database with the fact sheet of EUA by FDA regarding the vaccine. I gave an example of Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, and so I just pinpoint one point. Pfizer vaccine was originally approved for 16 years of age and older, and currently expanded to 12 years of age. So I'm not going to each of the detail, but take-home message is the prescription drug labeling contains a summary of essential scientific information needed for the safety and effective use of the drug. And the FDA label is a web-based database tool that allows us flexible and customized search of human prescription drug, biological, and over-counter labeling documents. And the FDA label is a public available for healthcare professional and the patient and the research and the support advanced public health advance. So this is a large teamwork, and it's across FDA centers, and mainly in CTR FDA label team was under leadership of Dr. Wada Tong, and mainly in the database development and maintenance. And in the CEDAR side, we had under leadership of Dr. Lillian Rosaria, and a coordinated effort with the user reviews and with labeling expert and the leadership under Eric Brodesky. And we have so many collaborators, and we just want to thank you everybody for your great contribution, and also thank you for your attention. Hello.
Thank you so much, Hong. I'm really pleased to introduce our next speaker, Brian Lappin. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks, Christine. My name is Brian Lappin, and I work in FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research in the Office of Communications. And I'm happy to share with you today findings from patient focus groups FDA has conducted on the topic of biosimilar biological products. Biosimilars are relatively new to this market as treatment options for a variety of chronic diseases, and as such, they present obstacles to public health in terms of patient awareness, understanding, and trust of these products. I'll present today what FDA has learned from patients about their knowledge and attitudes toward these products, and share with you how FDA is empowering patients by obtaining their input to develop evidence-based educational materials. First, I'd like to provide brief explanations of biologics and biosimilars to anyone who might be unfamiliar. Biologics are medicines made from natural and living sources such as animal cells or yeast. Biologics range in size but are generally larger and more complex than chemical medicines. And here we see how some example biologics, the three to the right, compare in molecular size and complexity with aspirin, a simpler chemical medicine, the smallest one to the left. The production of biologics is also more complicated than chemical medicines because living cells can make exact copies of proteins, but other add-ons or changes may occur, which can result in millions of slightly different versions of the same molecule per dose or batch of medication. And as a result, biologics manufacturers try to keep a consistent mix of variants across batches of their products and over time. Biologic medications are an increasingly popular treatment option in the United States. However, biologics are considerably more expensive than synthetic drugs, which can limit patient access and reduce adherence. In 2017, according to data from the IQVIA Institute, biologic drugs represented 2% of all U.S. prescriptions, but 37% of net drug spending. A biosimilar is a biologic product that is highly similar to and has no clinically meaningful differences from an original biologic, also called a reference product. Biosimilars are made with the same types of natural sources and are as safe and effective as the reference product they are compared to. Biosimilars are to original biologics much like generic drugs are to brand name drugs. Both biosimilars and generic drugs are FDA approved, and both create more competition in the healthcare market, which can lower costs and increase access to life-saving treatments. But unlike generics, biosimilars are not made with chemicals. Manufacturers make biosimilars by matching the variations in molecular patterns to those of a reference product. However, given the nature of their biological synthesis, natural differences can occur, and thus biosimilars are not identical copies of their reference product counterpart. The jars of jelly beans here show a simple way of thinking about how a biosimilar relates to an original biologic. Both jars include the same flavors and both satisfy a sweet tooth, but there are some natural differences in the pattern of the jelly beans that keep us from saying the jars are identical. As biosimilars entered the U.S. market, FDA first studied healthcare professionals' awareness and knowledge of these products. More recently, though, FDA has been studying patients' awareness and understanding of biosimilars and developing educational materials to meet their needs. In the summer of 2019, we conducted 10 online focus groups with a total of 78 patient participants. We recruited patients with various medical conditions who had been treated with biologics in the past 6 months. So for what you see here is inflammatory arthritis, various types of cancer, patients with inflammatory bowel disease or IBD, skin conditions like eczema and psoriasis, anemia, and patients taking Rituxan for a variety of conditions. The main discussion topics of the focus groups included knowledge and experience with taking biologics, communication with healthcare professionals about biologics, and information needs about biosimilars. These discussion topics accounted for approximately 75 minutes of each focus group session, and then after this, the remaining 15 minutes were used to obtain patients' feedback on draft communication materials developed by FDA. Our contractor, Forest Marsh, conducted qualitative coding and analysis on the transcripts using NVivo software. This analysis identified key themes and findings that I'll share with you on the following slides. So overall, participants reported little to no knowledge about biosimilars, with most saying they had never heard the term. Patients desired evidence when making claims about biosimilar safety and efficacy. Many wanted to know whether biosimilars had been approved by FDA. And several participants specified they would be opposed to taking drugs that are newer to the market for fear that the drugs had not been tested enough. The most important information for patients was similar across medical conditions. For many, a comparison of the effectiveness or potency of a biosimilar to their current biologic was important because of the difficult experiences they had had with other medications before being treated with their current biologic. A majority of participants prioritized information about what side effects they might experience when taking a biosimilar and whether they should expect different or more severe side effects than their current biologic. And despite cost savings being noted as one of the most important pieces of information about biosimilars, some participants conveyed that cost savings would only be a motivation to switch to a biosimilar if results and side effects would be the same or better than the biologic. Patients also provided feedback on this draft infographic, which they assessed as being understandable, easy to follow, and relevant. Participants said it covered all the basics well. They did not share any major concerns about the format, and they agreed that the red highlighted text appropriately calls attention to key points. However, patients also offered recommendations that led us to make several revisions to the infographic. We changed the title from Biosimilars 101 to Biosimilar Basics to remove the collegiate terminology. Some participants still lack the key understanding that biosimilars are a subcategory of biologics, so we defined biological products as being made from natural sources to bridge original biologics to biosimilars. We moved the phrase FDA approved earlier and highlighted it in red because we heard this generally instilled trust among participants. Some wanted clearer visual references, so we added new medical images like a syringe and infusion bag to better reflect the patient experience. A few participants questioned the language stating FDA continues to review the safety and effectiveness of biosimilars after their approval. This indicated to them that testing was limited and contributed to concerns about being a guinea pig for new medications. So in response, we clarified that FDA's post-market surveillance is done for all approved drugs and is not specific or limited to biosimilars. And we put more emphasis on the call to action to visit FDA's website. FDA's role is to increase awareness, and by emphasizing the website, we're directing patients from this general introduction of the topic to the wealth of information we have online about specific medicines and clinical data. So FDA used patients' feedback to refine this infographic and has also taken what it learned about patients' information needs to develop fact sheets and videos to provide patients more detailed information. As a next step, FDA conducted additional focus groups last summer and fall, this time using RTI International as its contractor, to conduct further testing of the refined infographic and the more recently developed fact sheets and videos. This slide shows the segmentation of those 2020 focus groups. Because of the pandemic, we wound up needing to conduct more groups with fewer participants in each, but we were able to reach our desired number of participants. We included patients with many of the same chronic medical conditions as were included in the 2019 study. However, you'll notice that we added patients with diabetes and caregivers of diabetic children. This is because FDA began regulating insulin as a biologic medication in March of 2020, which will allow multiple companies to produce biosimilar versions of insulins. So we definitely wanted the perspectives of these target audiences. You'll notice that we segmented the groups by education level as well to help ensure that we got feedback from lower education and lower literacy patients. Analysis of these focus groups is ongoing, but I wanted to share with you how FDA's empowerment of patients in the development of educational materials is ongoing. FDA recognizes the value of patients' perspectives in developing materials that can raise awareness, understanding, and appropriate use of medical treatments to improve the quality of life for individual patients and society more broadly. So with that, I'll just say thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Brian, for such an informative presentation. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Lola.
Yes, good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? Thank you for the invitation to participate in this program. I'm Lola Fashoina-Jay. I'm a medical oncologist and a Deputy Division Director in the Office of Oncologic Diseases in CEDAR. I also lead the Oncology Center of Excellence initiative to advance equity and inclusion. I'm going to be providing an overview of the Oncology Center of Excellence, or OCE's, programs that are designed to address subgroup underrepresentation in oncology clinical trials as a way to increase the evidence that is generated for these subgroups. I don't have any disclosures. So addressing barriers to clinical trial participation for groups that have historically been underrepresented in clinical research, including in clinical trials, is a priority area for the OCE for the following reasons. First, in the last decade, there have been unprecedented advances in understanding the pathways involved in cancer and in the development and approval of therapies that target these pathways. And given the serious and life-threatening nature of cancer, expedited access to potentially innovative therapies is a highly desirable goal for all patients and healthcare providers and the FDA. In oncology, we recognize that particularly when the benefits of the available treatments are limited or when there are no available treatments, participation in clinical trials may provide an option for patients. Additionally, as we primarily oversee the development of investigational therapeutics for cancer, we have an interest in ensuring that the drugs that we approve are safe and effective for the intended population. And it has been FDA's position that to do this, the data that is collected through clinical trials is conducted, through clinical trials that are conducted as part of the drug development process should reflect the intended population to enable generalizability and applicability of study results to the broader population that will receive the drug once it's approved. So diverse representation in drug development programs really provides an opportunity to evaluate drugs in the context that reflects the diverse the disease variability across many subgroups of the population, such that differences in drug response that may impact outcomes can be more easily identified. So we've heard from patients that they have more confidence in the drugs that we approve when patients like them are included in the clinical trials that support approval. Sorry, I have not been advancing my slides. Can you remind me how to advance these slides? Oh, here we go. All right. Great. You know, barriers that contribute to underrepresentation of certain demographic subgroups that are defined by race, ethnicity, extremes of age, sex, gender, and even geographic location have been extensively described, and I won't go through that during this talk, except to note that there are general access barriers, such as social determinants of health and bias, and even where clinical research is conducted that cannot be really adequately addressed in the context of a specific or single clinical trial. However, the OCE has identified as priority issues to address barriers such as clinical trial eligibility criteria, as well as trial procedures that, as a regulatory organization, we have opportunity to provide input on. And as drug development efficiencies are implemented to expedite you know, the development and approval of new medical products, it is especially important to ensure that the approaches that are used consider the impact on access to ensure that all subgroups can benefit. So the Oncology Center of Excellence has a number of programs aimed to increase the representation of historically underrepresented demographic subgroups in drug development and in clinical trials, including for older adults, pediatric patients, individuals who are members of racial, ethnic, sex, or gender minority groups, and for the underserved and underrepresented, such as, you know, populations that are in rural areas or even some urban populations. We have heard from these patients that they experience significant barriers to clinical trial participation, and the OCE programs really aim to focus specifically on these subgroups as a way to promote equity. I'm going to highlight a few of these programs. The first is Project Community, and through this program, the OCE engages with community-based organizations to provide education around the importance of clinical trial participation and provide transparency on FDA's role really in the development and approval of medical products. Patients and communities have shared that this information is really useful to them as they advocate for themselves, both in the doctor's offices, for themselves, for their families, but also with their government representatives. And through engagement, either by inviting these groups to participate, to talk with us through listening sessions, or through our own participation in community-based events, the OCE really learns about the needs of communities and patients directly from the source. And what we learn really informs our program priorities. And we did do several listening sessions during the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic on the impact on patients with cancer who really needed to continue to receive their treatments as restrictions were being implemented. And much of what we heard was really helpful to us as we increase our efforts to provide more clarity on the flexibilities that could be extended, particularly in the setting of clinical trial conduct. The second program I'll highlight is a program that I lead. It's Project Equity. There's also another program, Project Silver, which aims to improve the evidence base for treating older adults with cancer. These two programs really help engage and collaborate with external groups representing academia, professional organizations, and others in research and policy initiatives that are aimed to address barriers to clinical trial participation. And OCE includes diverse perspectives in our various regulatory activities, and very importantly, the perspective of the patient in all of our regulatory activities, whether they're from a review standpoint or for major symposia and research collaborations. As we really want to ensure that the needs of diverse and historically underserved and underrepresented groups are considered as we develop and implement our research and policy priorities and conduct our assessments of the data that are submitted to the FDA to support approval of new cancer treatments. And the third project I'll highlight is, or the fourth project I'll highlight is Project Facilitate, which is a program that we implemented to assist oncology providers, particularly those who practice in community settings and who have less support for regulatory interactions, to be able to access for their patients oncology investigational agents. And these programs are really, again, aimed at really improving access to clinical trials and to investigational therapies. As a final point, I want to say that the OCE also actively develops policy to provide, again, more transparency on our expectations with regards to the representation of demographic and even clinically defined subgroups that are inadequately represented in clinical trials that support approval of FDA, support FDA approval. So I want to switch gears here a little bit and talk specifically about one area that we have focused on in the OCE, and that's the eligibility criteria, which really can be a significant barrier to clinical trial participation. And efforts have been underway for many years now to address overly restrictive eligibility criteria that are not adequately adjusted for the specific clinical setting or the drug's mechanism of action, really rather sort of vestiges of an era where cytotoxic agents with their indiscriminate toxicities prevailed. So following collaboration with external groups, including the American Society of Clinical Oncology, to reassess the clinical trial eligibility criteria and develop a framework for broadening them to be more inclusive and to reconsider some of them altogether, there have been several oncology guidances that have been issued, as you see on the slide. And to ensure broader and more consistent adoption of these recommendations, the OCE initiated a program to operationalize the framework set forth by these recommendations in disease-specific contexts, just really to help sponsors adopt these recommendations more broadly and consistently. So there's often a tension between efficiency and speed needed to develop drugs for patients with serious and life-threatening conditions, as well, and to also study these drugs in a clinically and demographically diverse population. And this slide is really aimed to highlight some of the approaches that can dually improve efficiency, but also help to generate data that facilitates broader usage of approved therapies before they when they're approved. So innovative trial designs are increasingly used in oncology as a way to improve efficiency. As an example, platform trials evaluate multiple drugs in a single trial infrastructure, a single design and protocol, and they often use a common control, and this really allows patients to have a greater chance of being enrolled in the investigational treatment arm rather than in the control arm. And another strategy is really that we support in our FDA oncology is to design trials that incorporate one or more cohorts of patients that are enrolled on the basis of less restrictive criteria to enable sort of concurrent collection of data that will inform treatment of populations with, as an example, more comorbid conditions than would traditionally be allowed to enroll in clinical trials. And another point on efficiency is really that the site-based model that has been traditionally used that restricts the conduct of trials to major centers of excellence may not really provide the access to clinical trials to patients who face financial, geographic challenges. And so, FDA has been evaluating models that provide access to clinical trials that really meet patients where they are, including at a minimum conducting some trial-related activities in sites that are different than that sort of primary clinical major site. And we've heard from patients that a framework that really prioritizes patient convenience and employs flexibility in the number and frequency and location of study assessment should really be adopted when appropriate. I think I'm running out of time, but I will conclude by just sort of briefly highlighting that there are some considerations that are on, or some efforts that are ongoing in oncology to really continue to think about how to broaden access and promote equity, and some of them have to do with decentralizing clinical trials and really making sure that all subgroups of the population are benefiting from the efficiencies that that provides, ensuring that there's broader adoption of clinical trial eligibility criteria that are reflective of the patient population that will use the drug once approved, and that these plans are prospectively defined and incorporated along with other aspects of the drug development program. And we're also looking at how we can use real-world data and real-world evidence as supportive or complementary to clinical trial setting to improve the evidence for these subgroups. I will conclude by thanking and acknowledging my colleagues who lead some of these initiatives, and I provided our contact information here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Lola, for such an informative presentation. Our next up, we have Amy Lando. Welcome, Amy.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today. It looks like those aren't my slides. Hello? Yeah, can you bring up the slides for FSANS?
Amy Lando.
One moment.
We're just checking here. These are the ones we have. Let's hold on here. Brian, this is what we have for Lando. This says Lando, session 3.
No, unfortunately, that's not my presentation.
All right, what we're going to do here quickly is we're going to go to Shivani right now. Yeah, you can screen share if you like. Do you have your slides on your desktop?
I do.
We're going to do that real quick. So I'm going to give you that, and we'll just share your desktop real quick. There you go. Hit share my screen.
Do you see my screen? I'm sorry, I don't.
The big in the center.
Oh, yep.
And then share desktop. I'll tell you when we see it. All right, go ahead and hit play mode, and we'll go ahead and put it into slideshow mode.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm hit.
We're at the top of the screen. Click on slideshow.
Oh, yeah, okay.
All right, we see it. Go ahead, take it away.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, and thank you. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to be talking about FSANS, which is FDA's Food Safety and Nutrition Survey. And let me just introduce myself. I'm Amy Lando. I'm a social scientist in the Consumer Studies branch in the Division of Public Health and Informatics and Analytics in the Office of Analytics and Outreach over at FSANS. And before I get going, I wanted to acknowledge my colleagues. This is a team project, like almost every project here at FDA. I'm there on the left, Amy Lando, and my 3 colleagues who've worked super close for the last couple of years on this project are Linda Verrill, Fan Wu, and Martine Ferguson. And of course, many others contributed, but this is the core team, so thank you. Before we get going into what is FSANS, I wanted to just start off by talking what is the value of FSANS. And we really identified 3 major points. The first is, of course, we use the survey data to understand what consumers know, believe, and do with respect to food safety and nutrition. We use this information to develop and evaluate our consumer education materials. And of course, we can use this data, and I'll go into the reasons why, but we can use this data to monitor trends over time in consumer behavior, knowledge, and attitudes, and that's really helpful for us as well. we have transitioned to FSANS from two surveys that we've been conducting since the 1980s. We had a food safety survey since 1988 and a health and diet survey since 1982. And those surveys were conducted every 3 to 5 years, and they were phone surveys. And so we would call people up on the phone, interview them, get their opinions about food safety or nutrition and health and diet, and that was how we conducted our survey. But starting in the last, 5 to 10 years, we've realized, like everyone else conducting surveys, that it's really, really hard to get people to answer their phone. And so we knew we had to transition our survey to a way that works with where consumers are today, which is not on the phone, not talking to them, but online mostly, and also for those who don't have access to online, with paper and pencil. And so we switched methodologies from a phone survey to an address-based sampling, where we would send people letters in the mail asking them to go online and take our survey. And we changed the name. We also combined our food safety and nutrition topics together and changed our name to FSANS, which is the Food Safety and Nutrition Survey. At the same time, since we wanted to be able to maintain those trends, we also conducted a smaller RDD comparison survey at the same time. So we conducted both surveys simultaneously with different sampling and different methods, so we could expect of switching from an RDD phone survey to this new online and web and paper survey. And there are a couple of reasons why, again, we wanted to switch modes. And the most important one is, of course, because people don't want to answer the phone and talk to a stranger on the phone to take a survey. But there's other reasons as well. By changing to an address-based sampling method online and paper and pencil, we're able to increase our response rate. We're able to increase our population coverage, increase the number of questions, because we can actually keep people on a little bit longer than you can on the phone. You can ask them more questions and get more opinions from them. And as I mentioned, we did conduct that smaller phone survey to ensure our mode continuity. And we were able to combine both food safety and nutrition topics. And on the right-hand side, you can see an example of our cover letter, or the initial letter that we sent people inviting them to take part in our survey. So in the end, we had 3 different versions of our survey. We had, on the left is a screenshot of our web version of the survey when you got online, and if you put your unique ID into the website, you were taken to this website and asked to participate and go take the survey online. For those people who didn't have online access, we sent them a hard copy, a paper and pencil version, and that's in the center of your screen. And finally, on the right is a screenshot of an RDD interviewer screen. And so for the small amount of people that we contacted online, we had interviewers, a set of interviewers, trained interviewers, walk people through the survey over the phone. We were able to incorporate a number of different topics because of this change in methodology. And so this slide kind of shows all the topics we were able to cover on our new survey. We've divided into 4 main categories. We have questions about shopping, which involve questions about how consumers use the nutrition facts label on the food. We have questions about how consumers look at food package claims that are often on the front of the package, like healthy, organic, natural. We have questions about their purchase behaviors and beliefs with respect to organic and GE foods. We also have a number of questions about how consumers prepare their food, looking at food handling, hand washing, thermometer use, how they use their cutting boards and clean them, how they go about grilling and cooking meat and chicken, and what they do after touching raw meat and chicken. We have a number of questions about raw foods, about recipes and cooking ability. Finally, under eating, we have a number of questions about how often and what types of restaurants consumers go to, if they've seen menu labeling, health inspection scores, or consumer advisories when they're out at restaurants. And I'll just be clear that this survey was conducted in 2019, so all of our data are pre-COVID, and before it was very difficult for consumers to go out to restaurants. So this is really a baseline of the before time. And finally, we have a number of questions about consumers' diet knowledge and practice, about their food safety perception, their knowledge, a few questions about their prevalence of food allergies, and some questions about consumption of potentially risky foods. And finally, we have a couple of questions about how consumers store food, in particular meat and chicken dishes, to make sure that they're storing those foods safely and properly. This slide just shows the details of the survey methodology. Again, we really focused on the address-based sampling. That was our main frame, which is a mail push to web. Again, we sent people letters in the mail and encouraged them to go online to take it. But if they couldn't take it online, we did send them a hard copy. So we were able to include people who both felt comfortable going online as well as those who didn't. We had over 4,000 respondents. We did target the U.S. population of adults 18 and older. And again, as I mentioned, the survey was fielded prior to COVID, so it's a baseline for any post-COVID work back in October and November of 2019. We were able to offer the survey in both English and Spanish. To encourage participation and to drive up our response rate, we took numerous steps, including sending a $2 advance token of appreciation. And you can see we had a very good response rate for our ABS sample of 28%. And as I mentioned, some of the questions were versioned because we were interested in both food safety and nutrition, and there was no way we could have the survey, have people do both. We did version the survey. So I'm not going to get into the details of the results today. We just don't have time, and there's so many. But I wanted to highlight a few ways where you can go to find all the results that we have to date. And one idea that's still under, it's sort of under a prototype right now, is we're going to have a Shiny application where people can go online and search for questions of interest and find statistics that they're interested in. I wanted to highlight two posters that we have today at the FDA Science Forum. It's in session 3, and if you search online at the FDA Science Forum website, FSANS or survey, these two great posters will come out by my colleagues that I mentioned earlier. One is on transitioning the food safety survey, and they're doing a mode comparison between the RDD and ABS samples. I think that will be really interesting poster. And the second one focuses on our nutrition labeling questions. So please check out our posters here at the Science Forum. And finally, there's other places you can find more results of FSANS. If you go online, you can find a summary report on the FDA website. As I mentioned, our Shiny app will be available soon. And finally, we have one publication that is already available and another one that is currently under review on the mode comparison. And finally, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to contact me, and my email address is here. So with that, I want to say thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amy, for such a great presentation. Next up, we have Giovanni Spinner. Welcome, Giovanni. Oh, Giovanni, we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the invitation today. I'm very happy to be here. Again, my name is Dr. Giovanni Spinner, and I'm the Associate Director of Outreach and Communications in the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity. And today I want to be talking about some of our outreach and communication strategies to reach diverse audiences as we have responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that health disparities continue to exist for racial and ethnic minorities, tribal, and other underrepresented groups. And COVID-19 has been no exception. It has really exposed the extent of health disparities experienced by these groups. In our office and as FDA as a whole, we take very seriously our obligation to address health disparities like those that have recently come under the spotlight. So I can think of no better time to highlight some of the efforts of our office. I don't have anything to disclaim. As you know, we are a regulatory agency, and we have taken and will continue to take active steps to provide communities access to credible health information so they can make decisions about COVID-19. We want everyone to know that FDA is a resource for scientific, factual information about medical products that diagnose, treat, and prevent COVID-19. In my office, in the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity, we work to address health disparities. And we've been working hand in hand not only across the agency, but also with our external stakeholders to support our agency efforts in the response to this pandemic. Our particular focus has been to address concerns about vaccines among diverse communities, and I'll walk you through a few of our strategies that we have been employing. So in our office, we manage a broad range of portfolios for our intramural and extramural research that addresses minority health concerns. We also have multiple outreach strategies to ensure that diverse communities have the health information that they need to make well-informed decisions for their health. And some of these strategies include developing health education campaigns, doing social media outreach, and creating health education materials like brochures and fact sheets that consumers can use to make decisions. I want to mention that we cannot do our work in a silo. We are very dependent upon our stakeholder engagement, and engaging with stakeholders is definitely critical to our success. As I mentioned, we have been working across the agency and engaging with external stakeholders to, one, better understand what our consumers' needs as it relates to COVID-19 and how we can be a better service to make sure that we are adequately addressing those needs and providing the information that they need to make decisions. Two of our priority areas are definitely addressing COVID-19 and also clinical trial diversity. And as you can see on the slide, we have many other priority areas related to chronic disease prevention, also related to language access and other issues that disproportionately impact racial and ethnic minority groups. Over the last year, the COVID-19 pandemic has definitely highlighted and exacerbated health inequities across the United States. We know that many communities have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, and unfortunately, many racial ethnic groups have been targeted with misinformation about COVID-19. So in response to that, we wanted to make sure that we develop culturally relevant and linguistically tailored health education materials. Also making sure we are engaging stakeholders who are working with different groups to help amplify the reach of our health education messages, and then also to promote clinical trial diversity. The crux of our work is really about meeting consumers and stakeholders at their place of need. So we have a variety of different strategies that we are using to make sure that people have information in a manner that they can understand and act upon. One of our primary resources to provide information about COVID-19 is our webpage. And on this webpage, you can find different resources like videos, toolkits, printable resources like brochures and fact sheets. Also, we have podcasts and other consumer articles, as well as links to some of our sister agencies' resources like the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. As I mentioned, clinical trial diversity is one of our key priority areas in the office. And we know that historically, racial and ethnic minority groups have been underrepresented in clinical trials. And populations that are often disproportionately burdened by many chronic and debilitating diseases like heart disease and diabetes, for example, and now COVID-19, this makes the need for diverse participation in clinical research more critical than ever. So with the development of our campaign, we're really aiming to combat some of the common myths that we are hearing and to educate consumers about key issues, making sure that we are providing positive messaging, we are being reflective and having diverse spokespersons to help amplify those key messages. They represent the diverse communities that we are serving, and also to make sure that we're able to stimulate dialogue, not only from peer to peer, but also from peer to medical providers. So consumers are armed when they're going into their medical appointments to be able to talk to their providers about engaging in clinical research. Our campaign includes broad stakeholder engagement, and some of those activities include public meetings, holding listening sessions, and working through trusted messengers to extend the reach of our information. And of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we have continued to increase amplification of messages to raise awareness about the need for minority participation in clinical trials. Next, let's talk through some of the materials and resources that we have developed to educate on COVID-19. First, we have our COVID-19 toolkit, and this toolkit was entitled Vaccine Ready, and it includes graphics, videos, Twitter and Facebook messages around COVID-19 vaccine development, the authorization process, and the benefits of getting vaccinated against COVID-19. This toolkit is available in English and in Spanish, and it really is a one-stop shop for stakeholders to be able to share information with their networks. Next, we have our podcast and our webinars. We hosted a webinar on the vaccine approval process and key information for minority communities to be aware of. Also, as a part of our Health Equity Podcast series, we hosted a podcast on FDA's efforts to combat health fraud, and particularly helping to prevent fraudulent products from reaching our markets, especially those making false claims to prevent, treat, or cure COVID-19. We also have, we've published several different blogs, and here is one blog that we co-authored with the Center Director of CBER, which is the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. And in this blog, we're discussing vaccine hesitancy and providing additional information and resources for diverse communities to help raise awareness about the importance of getting vaccinated. We also have a whole repository of multilingual resources. For example, we've developed and translated materials to help consumers, again, make informed decisions about their health. For example, we've supported the development and translation of information for the COVID-19 Multilingual Resources webpage. And this features a growing collection of educational materials. Right now, we have over 20 languages on pertinent COVID-19 health topics, such as social distancing, diagnostic testing, vaccine development, fraudulent medical products, and the emergency use authorization process.
Hi, I'm Rura Morshardi-Arrojo, Associate Commissioner for Minority Health. Here at FDA, we are committed to bringing safe and effective medical products to the market to prevent and treat COVID-19. Diverse researchers and scientists that look like you have worked hard to develop vaccines to help protect our communities. Thousands of diverse volunteers have participated in COVID-19 vaccine trials to ensure we have data on all types of people, representing different races, ethnicities, genders, and ages, to know if any group responds differently to the vaccines. Our dedicated scientists and researchers are working around the clock to review the clinical trial data and ensure the vaccines meet FDA's high standards for safety and effectiveness. And
That was just one example of some of the videos that we have developed to educate on COVID-19. And as I mentioned earlier, stakeholder engagement is very important to our success. And here's just a sample of some of the stakeholders that we have worked with over the past year. We have an e-alert that goes out every week, so please sign up for our listserv so you can get up-to-date information on FDA's response efforts. And we also do a ton of social media outreach on our Twitter page. And again, this is making sure that we have positive messaging that's educating consumers so they can make informed decisions about their health. And I will stop there and thank you for your time and attention. And if you have any additional questions, you can feel free to reach out to us at the email address below. And also make sure you sign up for our resources so you can stay in the know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Devani. That was really excellent. I particularly enjoyed the video. So just a quick question before we move into closing announcements. I do have a question for Jessica Weinberg. Is she still on the call? Oh, great. Hi, Jessica. I have one question for you. Did you encounter any challenges to conducting research given the COVID-19 pandemic? And if so, how did you overcome them?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Christine. There are definitely extra challenges with conducting focus groups during the pandemic, as some of our populations might not be as familiar with using online video platforms. They may be untrusting or uncomfortable with them, and they might not have steady internet access. So recruitment during COVID can also be a challenge, as some of the traditional methods like flyering or community outreach might be limited with people staying at home more. Fortunately, the University of Maryland Patients Program had already established connections with community members, so we were able to quickly recruit, gain trust, and train participants on how to use the technology when needed. In other contexts, it might have taken longer to complete recruitment of hard-to-reach populations, given all of the restrictions and new obstacles that COVID has posed. And we also were able to leverage lessons learned from other FDA research efforts during COVID to better understand how to conduct totally virtual focus groups.
Thank you so much, Jessica. It looks like that my camera has decided to stop working at the end. So I will close out the day. Thank you to all of our fantastic speakers. This was incredibly informative. Thank you for attending day 1 of the 2021 FDA Science Forum. Please join us tomorrow at 8:55 a.m. for day 2. And be sure to visit the 2021 FDA Science Forum virtual poster exhibit on FDA.gov. Thank you so very much. I hope everyone has a great evening.